thank you to our sponsor, Bosque Trails Hospice, for hosting us here today. We are going to learn a lot about hospice today and all things related. I also want to thank our other sponsors who helped make this festival possible. A Good Goodbye, that's me. Bernalillo County, their indigent program, Better Place for Us, Conscious Crossroads End of Life Services, Deaf Doula Danielle, and Deaf Doula Professionals, Brooke Nutting. End of Life Options New Mexico, thank you for the bagels and the coffee. French Funerals and Cremations, Keeper Memorials for the online access on Zoom, and Passages International, also longtime supporter of my work. I'm Gail Rubin. My title is the Doyenne of Death. It's death, not death. When I'm on airplanes and I say this, and people are like, "Oh yeah, you know American Sign Language?" And I say, "No." Did not hear me correctly. A doyenne is a woman who's considered senior in a group who knows a lot about a particular subject. And I was not always the Doyenne of Death. My background is actually public relations and event planning. But when I got married in 2000, Dave and I had a very creative Jewish Western wedding, and everybody had such a good time. I wanted to write a book about creative life cycle events and call it Matchings, Hatchings, and Dispatchings. About weddings and births and deaths. I got to write a monthly feature in the Albuquerque Tribune, and it was the stories about death and funerals that got the most reader response. So I figured, well, you know, there's already plenty about creative wedding planning. We don't need more about that. But there was not much about creative funeral planning. So I focused on funerals. And my first book, A Good Goodbye, Funeral Planning for Those Who Don't Plan to Die, came out, and that changed the course of my career. I became a certified funeral celebrant. I became certified in thanatology, the study of death, dying, and bereavement. And cool tip, thanatology comes from the Greek demigod Thanatos, who is the personification of a good death. And his twin brother is Hypnos, which is sleep. So sleep and the good death are closely related. In the past year and a half, 5 of my family members have died on hospice. And I have been involved with all of them. And they're all different. But it actually started 3 years ago with a 6th death on the hospice for my friend Gary. Gary was my boyfriend in the 1990s. And Gary had a very particular way of living. You know, he was very structured. It was like Monday and Thursdays was gaming night with the boys. And Wednesday night was Wednesday night guitar group. And every other Tuesday, Gary would take me out to dinner. And this continued after I married Dave in 2000. Dave got to come along after a while, and Gary always picked up the check. He was such a kind, funny, generous man. And earlier in his life, Gary had been a smoker. And this led to COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Well, Gary was also very much an independent-minded man. He wanted to stay in his home for as long as he possibly could. And I became his hospice contact. So once a week, we'd meet with the nurse and we'd go over how he was doing, what his goals were. Always, he just wanted to stay in his house. And every Tuesday night, Dave and I would bring Gary out dinner to Gary. And Gary still always picked up the check. Well, one Tuesday, I called at 11 o'clock in the morning. We had actually gotten to this point in his decline in health that I was calling him every morning at 11 o'clock just to, make sure things are okay. And this particular Tuesday I called and I said, what do you want for dinner? And he said, green chili cheeseburgers. Excellent choice. So I called back at 4 o'clock to ask what kind of cheese he wanted on his burger. No answer. We got over to his house with the burgers, and usually the door was unlocked when you were expected, but not this time. I had a key, let us in. So Gary was on oxygen 24/7, and we walk in, the lights are all out. He's not sitting in his chair in the dining room. I followed the oxygen tube into the bedroom. He wasn't in the bedroom, and the oxygen tube went into the bathroom. And there was Gary, curled up on the white tile floor. No pulse, room temperature. He had checked out before we got there, probably several hours before that. But one of the elements of all of my hospice experiences with my friends and family is we had pre-planned and prepaid for funeral arrangements. Gary wanted direct cremation. And when I was writing A Good Goodbye, he was one of my helpers in research. We went around to various funeral homes and found out, hey, there's a very big variation in prices. So it's really a lot better to shop around before somebody dies. And when you go on hospice, they are going to ask, have you made your arrangements, right? Yes. So we called the hospice. This is what you do. When somebody dies on hospice at home, you don't call 911. You call the hospice. They send a hospice nurse who makes the pronouncement, and then the funeral home is contacted. And usually it's the hospice that contacts the funeral home on your behalf, assuming you have prearranged. And you don't want to be in a position where you got to be calling different funeral homes to figure out what you're going to do with this dead body you got on your hands, in whether you're on hospice or not. So when the funeral home picked Gary's body up, and Dave and I drove back home, and then I kind of burst into tears. But the whole time when I found him, I was like, okay, got to call the hospice. And then we ate our burgers because Gary wouldn't want us to. So that was my first experience with that. And when we were cleaning out his house, which is a whole nother thing you have to deal with when people die, is, you know, cleaning out the apartment, the house, whatever. I found in the refrigerator, he had asked for just somebody to come in and help cook a little bit for him during the week. So the woman who had been coming in and helping him had made mini hamburgers for him, like, you know, just the size of quarters. So his appetite had really declined in those last few days. And one of the other things he said, because they were like, well, we can send somebody to give you a bath. And he was like, if somebody has to be bathing my wizened body, I do not want to be around. And I think he was trying to get into the bathtub to take a shower, and the oxygen might have come off his face, and then it was like, because he needed that oxygen all the time. So then in April of last year, my husband Dave died on hospice. Totally different situation. Dave was 72. David had cardiac history. He'd had 4 heart attacks, some stents in his heart. But his cardiologist had cleared him to have prostate surgery. He had a large prostate. And he had the surgery on April 4th, which was actually one of the days he had one of his heart attacks. Not a good omen. And actually, that's 4-4. And the Chinese will tell you fours are death. Yeah. 2 days after the surgery, he had chest pain. And we didn't know it at the time, but it was a heart attack. Day after that, he was very weak and confused. I said, you know, we really should go to the emergency room. And he was like, no, let's call the cardiologist. He called the cardiologist and the nurse said, go to the emergency room. He's like, no, let's go to the urgent care center. And I was like, you idiot. But, you know, he was insistent, so we went to the urgent care center and they got him in very quickly. Turned out he was going into sepsis. His kidneys were failing. And they were like, we're taking you to the hospital from here. And I was like, we could have avoided an ambulance ride if you had only agreed to go to the hospital, which is not far from our house. And they had him in the ICU that first night, then put him in a step-down unit. They had to wait until his kidneys improved to do a catheterization or cardiac cath to find out what happened with his heart. Yes, he did have a heart attack. And the day after that, he coded in the hospital. Not once, but twice. And they revived him. They were doing CPR with a mechanical device that broke 3 ribs. Back in the ICU, all kinds of things still going wrong. His blood pressure kept dropping. And he had a surge. Heard of the surge. One day he got out of the bed, he was sitting in the chair, they got him to walk around the ICU with a walker, and we were like, okay, maybe we can get him to a rehab facility. And then the next day, crash. Couldn't get out of bed, he was incoherent, and his blood pressure kept dropping, and at that point they said, it's time for comfort care. And they actually put him in inpatient hospice at Casement, which is a gorgeous facility. If you got to use an inpatient hospice, that's the place to be. And it was kind of funny, the Friday morning that the woman came to sign him in for hospice, she said, you're Gail Rubin? Such a fangirl. Yes, it's the little bright spot, and was pretty dark time for me. And then I was with Dave around the clock at the hospice, and they had this fold down dinette thing that turned into a pretty comfortable bed. Brought a blanket. I was there around the clock to advocate for him if he was agitated. He was not cognizant this whole time. And he was admitted on a Friday. A week went by, and Friday night, I'm sitting there, and the hospice actually gave me all of the papers from the emergency visit, the hospitalization, the hospice admission, and there was so much that went wrong with poor Dave. And I left the room to make a phone call to a girlfriend of mine to catch up about everything that had been happening. And 15 minutes later, the nurse comes in and says, his breathing has changed, you better come back. He had already died while he was out of the room. Didn't want me to see him die. And it wasn't until I took the ring off his finger and the funeral home came, and I followed walked down the hallway. They went to the left to take his body out the back door, because that's what they do. And I went right, and that was till death do we part. But again, we had pre-planned our funerals the year before, and many of you know my motto: talking about sex won't make you pregnant, talking about funerals won't make you dead. 15 years, so far so good for me. And it made such a big difference when it came time to actually implement those funeral plans. I walked into the funeral home with my brother-in-law, Stephen, and I said, I have no idea how people who do not plan ahead deal with this. I've been in many, many funeral homes over the course of my career, but this time it very much felt different. But because we had planned ahead, it was easy, it was quick, maybe spent an hour finalizing what we were going to do. And by the way, I had written a nice obituary that talked about Dave, and they showed me the draft that the Albuquerque Tribune had sent back. And I was like, we are the people freaks. This is like long Congo text. Dave would not approve. And they were like, well, you know, it can cost less with a paragraph, you know, without them. And I was like, I'll pay extra for the paragraph breaks. Well, so that was April. And then I went to Florida to visit my parents, who used to go back and forth between Florida and New Mexico in the summer, Florida in the winter. It was my parents' 69th wedding anniversary. And so we were all getting together to celebrate that milestone. And, you know, I told my folks about what happened with the hospice experience. And 2 months later, my dad turned 93 on August 21st. So he beat his parents by 10 years. His parents died at 83. And then 2 days later, he was in the hospital having heart trouble. And by the way, he had heart trouble back in April when I was dealing with all this stuff with Dave. And I was talking to my dad on the phone as they were waiting for the EMTs to come and take him to Delray Medical Center. And he said, I want what Dave had. He knew. He knew this was probably it. And he wanted to go out as comfortably as possible. And I said, we will get that for you. So that was Wednesday. Thursday morning, he signed into the hospice. My older brother Mitch lives here in Albuquerque. We flew to Florida on Saturday. He was just starting to kind of slip into unconsciousness, but he said it all went so fast. I love you to pieces. So I didn't spend the night in the hospice that night, but I spent the next 2 nights there, again, on these couch things they stretch out. And inpatient hospice, they'll provide the family with food. When I was at Caseman with Dave, they were bringing me breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and I was like, this is great. I don't have to, you know, go to the vending machine. I'm not sure if every hospice, inpatient hospice, does that, because they did send some food when he was still somewhat cognizant when we first got there, but they stopped doing that. But that was a lovely facility also, but it was a lot bigger than Caseman. Caseman is just 10 beds. And I don't know how many beds were in this place. But they always have security. It's like, we need to see your ID. It's like, I don't know why they do that, but they want the place to be secure for sure. And again, with Dad, I sang to him. I'm not a great singer, but Dad loved musicals. So I sang some songs from musical. Dulcinea from Man of La Mancha, Old Man River. And then I was like, why am I singing? I'll just put it on the iPad, you know, pull up Spotify and like musical numbers. So I did. And I could tell my dad liked it. It calmed him down. And then this male nurse comes in and he's like, stop playing that music. It's too energizing or something along the lines. You don't know my dad. So that was kind of a weird experience. And then I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning and I looked at my dad and I saw he was still breathing. And I fell back asleep. 10 minutes later, he was gone. These nurses burst in. They said, "Your daddy is gone." And I was like, how did they know that? You know, there's no monitoring equipment on them or pulse or whatever, but sure enough, he was gone. I don't know if they have a spirit meter that in the hospital. And again, this was in Florida. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. Our whole family was raised there. So my parents had their burial plots in Northern Virginia, where my grandparents are buried. So I went from New Mexico to Florida, and then from Florida, planning a funeral, which had already been pre-arranged and prepaid for. Big help. Flew to DC. We were there for a couple of days and then back to Albuquerque. And I got to tell you, my dreams after I very not grounded, feeling like, oh, I got all these different places I got to do. Then that was August. And in late October, I'm having dinner with my in-laws, Myra and her second husband, Al. Al is a big character in this story. Al was a big man, a big, large, and in charge kind of guy. And he was also, could be very cruel. He had alienated a lot of people in his life. And both of them were having some cognitive issues. They could fake it, but with enough time, you could see Myra would ask the same question in 3 hours, less than 3 hours. He couldn't remember the names of streets or restaurants or people, but he could still talk a big game. So we were at dinner with their friend, Bob. Bob's wife had accessed medical aid in dying the previous summer. And I was interested, I wanted to hear about it. So he was telling us about it, and I'm looking at Al, and I can see the wheels turning. But then he said something to me that was incredibly cruel. So Dave's been dead 6 months. And Al says, oh, in this life, it's just me and Myra, just Myra and me. I looked at him and I said, what am I, chopped liver? I've been married to Dave for 22 years, 4 months and a day before he died. And 6 months later, I don't count. He said, what am I, chopped liver? He said, yes, you are chopped liver. So that's the kind of personality I was dealing with. Well, I wanted to get Myra to pre-plan for Al and her. And I actually got her to agree, we'll go out to lunch, and we'll go to French, and we'll pre-plan, we'll have a nice time, and it'll be great. Well, it turns out, before we could do that, she fell and fractured her pelvis. And so she was hospitalized briefly. And then this is where some of the dementia starts kicking in. Al, she was put, so they lived at Levine, and they had this health center there where she was transferred from the hospital to the health center to help her recover. Well, Al says, that's the different word. She's gonna die there. So he actually kidnapped her from the health center and took her back to their casita, and then complained that he had to take care of her. So at this point, he gets this brilliant idea that he wants both of them to access medical aid in dying together. They're both 94, and so they both go on hospice in late November. They're like, okay, I changed my mind. I want you to go ahead and pre-plan our funerals. He was very much against it. and actually hung up on me when I was calling to say, Myra and I are going to go do this. He was like, nope, don't do it. Well, when they decide we are going to die, go ahead. You go and pre-plan and prepay, and that'll be good. Well, so Myra's son, Stephen, comes in from out of town. Al's granddaughter and great grandson come in from Wyoming. We're hoping to have, okay, if they're going to do this, let's all get together and support them. But Al was very angry and confused. He yelled at me several times and even accused me of getting them kicked off of hospice. And this was before the doctor actually evaluated them for whether they qualified or not. So, turns out Myra qualified, but Al was too healthy. And so they stayed on hospice for a couple more weeks, and Al was like, I don't like these people coming around and checking my blood pressure, blah, blah, blah. So they revoked hospice. Time goes by, and then we go to it's late June. I come back from being out, and I find a phone message on my answering machine from Al. This is Al. Al and Myra are dying. Send help. Apartment 813. Like, I don't know where they live. So I call up. Bob is there. Their good friend Bob. And I say, should I come over? And Myra shakes her head no. We're like, okay. Maybe not today, but certainly tomorrow or Friday. So I plan on bringing chicken salad for lunch on Friday. And I'm driving over there, and Bob calls and says, you better get over here fast. I was like, I'm 5 minutes away. I'm on my way. I get there, and Al is sitting in his easy chair in his bathrobe, drinking water, but he's not like interacting with anybody. And Bob and Myra say, what should we do? Should we call an ambulance? I said, I think it's time to get back with that hospice. And I called their physician, and she agreed. So I called the hospice that they had been on with before, and they sent a nurse over in 2 hours. And they said, this man is actively dying. So he was beyond being able to access medical aid in dying because he was not cognizant enough to sign anything or talk to anybody. Although he did start talking on Saturday. He had a surge. He got up, he ate some food, he was making jokes. He was like, I don't know if I'm going up or I'm going down. And I was thinking, you're going down. And that night, so, he went to bed. So, and Myra, meanwhile, is sleeping a lot and not eating much at all. So she did re-qualify for medical aid in dying. And she was hoping maybe they could go together as close as possible. But what happened with Al, that Saturday evening, 7 o'clock at night, sundown, and you've heard of that, the patient gets really agitated. He got up, he was like, I got places to go, people to see, and I was like, where's that medication they gave me for anxiety? And Haldol was what was prescribed. And I gave him a dose of it. I also gave him a dose of morphine, not knowing I was giving him about 4 times more than I was supposed to give him. But he was a big guy. And this is one of the challenges of home hospice when you're putting a family member in charge. I did not realize the dosages exactly because I was like, oh, I'm planning on giving medication to people. Well, the Haldol, turns out, gave him horrible chest pain. And we're talking drama queen chest pain. He was like, oh God, chest pain. One ice pack on his chest. And in the midst of all this, a thunderstorm had blown up. And it's thundering and lightning and downpouring. And I'm sitting there next to the bed. I gave him more morphine. I called the hospice. They said, give him more morphine. I gave him more morphine. He was still in pain. The nurse finally got there through the thunderstorm. I'm sitting there looking at him thinking, you know, if he died right now, this would somehow be appropriate. An appropriate exit. Turns out Haldol can have a side effect of giving a patient chest pain. So that's what the pain was. It wasn't to, you know, send him to the hospital for any kind of intervention for that. But he lived through that. He got a little nauseous with all the extra morphine I was giving him, but then there was something else to give him to help with that. But this man, you know, they say you die the way you live. He had terminal agitation for 6 hours, 8 hours. I don't know. It went on and on and on, thrashing around on the bed. Thank God for my death duelists who came and helped. And finally, somebody, the nurse said, is there somebody who needs to be here? Because this guy is not letting go. And he had a son who had died in his 20s. He had a daughter who he was estranged from. Big surprise, that's where the granddaughter came from. And as soon as someone mentioned her name, he relaxed. And he died within 2 minutes. It was pretty remarkable. And then, after all of this, Myra was able to be scheduled for medical aid 9. Al died July 2nd. She was scheduled for July 8th. And it was a very strange feeling, knowing, okay, she's going to die on July 8th. We actually created a really lovely gathering in the living room, got her set up in the easy chair. We had music, we had death duelists. I was there, my brother was there, and my brother-in-law Stephen was there. We sang songs, we said loving things to her, and then when it was time to do the ingestion, the nurses were there with the sorbet and the 2-ounce glass of this white liquid, the combination of medications. Now, we didn't know there was a plan B, but plan A is to drink the whole 2 ounces within a minute, and then things will unfold from there. She took the first sip. Well, first she had the sorbet. She took the first sip, and she had a really bad reaction to the burning and the bitterness of that medication. So she had only drinking half of it, and you can't drink the whole thing. Stephen is right next to her. I'm on the other side. And he says, drink it if you want to see Al. She kept saying, I want to see Al after he had died. And, you know, she's still like, oh, God, it's so bitter. He's like, drink it if you want to see Al. And then he said it again. Drink it if you want to see Al. And she said, stop saying that. And those were her last words. She did drink the rest of it. Within 3 minutes, she was asleep. And within an hour, she had exhaled her last breath. It was very peaceful. It was a wonderful experience. And again, because we had pre-planned, a hospice called the funeral home, they came and got her body. We actually had a dual funeral for them, both in the same cemetery, graveside service together. And that was nice. It was good. And then my mom just died on October 31st, 95 years old. I have been to Florida 6 times this year. because she had pneumonia and was hospitalized, well, 3 times since July. And then skilled nursing stays. She really wanted to keep living, even though she was mad that dad died and, chose to go on hospice. So this time she was in the intensive care unit. Her pneumonia was aspiration related. She was just inhaling anything she drank or ate. And you can't fix that. And this time the ICU doctor said, it's time for hospice. And I was like, thank you. I've been trying to tell her that for 2 hospitalizations, but she didn't want to hear hospice. And I was there with her. She was put in the hospice on Sunday, the 20th of October. And she was still awake, but the doctor said, dying of respiratory failure is not comfortable. And they did palliative sedation for her. They kept bumping up the morphine and the Ativan in a kind of a patch into her arm. And just day by day, they kept upping the amount, and she was just sleeping all the time. And on Saturday a week ago, I was still in Florida. And the hospice nurse that morning said to me, you need to go take care of yourself. Go home, take care of her festival. She's in good hands here. And she was right. I came home, and so she did pass at 11:20. I'm planning a funeral now. But guess what? It's, it was already on file, already paid for. So I mean, I still got that travel I got to do and go take care of the state stuff. But so those are my hospice experiences, all different, but all peaceful and interesting to be so up close and involved with that. And I'm happy to answer any questions. If you have a story you'd like to share, come on up and share it. Introduce yourself.
Well, I'm Victoria Kane. I'm a bereavement counselor, also a thanatologist, and I'm the volunteer coordinator here at Bosque Trails Hospice. So my first experience with hospice was with my mother. I flew out there to California when my sisters told me she was in the hospital. She had congestive heart failure. We were sat down with the doctor, and he said, this is a picture. I don't even understand. There was a picture of her heart, and it looked like it was threads. I mean, I don't know if that's what a congestive heart failure looks like, but I don't know. It just looked not like a healthy heart. So we took her home on hospice. I'll skip a lot, but what was remarkable is we put her in my sister's living room and on a massage table. She was totally, basically sleeping. 2 things happened at one point after about a week and a half. Good friends came by, and she all of a sudden, according to them, sat up and said, Boyd, and she was just, there was Boyd, Phyllis and Boyd. And so that was a beautiful experience for them. And then I happened to be the one that was in the living room sleeping on the sofa when she actually took her last breaths. And what I experienced was, I call it angels, an angelic presence. And I could feel her being escorted, I just could feel it. I could see it, I could feel it. My stepsister from Kansas called and said she just passed, didn't she? And so, and then I got my sister kind of had stirred and woke up, and the other sister had woken up. So was my first experience with hospice. I don't know how common that is, but that was mine.
So I think you'll see from our stories that hospice helps you have a better death in the family than being in the hospital hooked up with the needles and the beeping and the blood draws and all that tough stuff. And I am so grateful to have been involved with these hospice deaths for my family to really illustrate that it can provide a peaceful passing, whether you're using medical aid in dying or not. And I highly encourage people to learn more about it. And I'm so glad we're here at Bosque Trails Hospice to really get into it and learn more details.
My older brother passed away in 2015, and he was, as a young man, he was really brilliant, skipped grades, got 2 master's degrees by the time he was 22 years old. But he probably had mental health issues, and given our age and where health science was, he wasn't diagnosed properly. He joined a religious cult, and we became estranged as a family with my oldest brother. We got a phone call from a social worker in 2015 that my brother was in hospice in Kona. And the story that we got was that he had been homeless for quite a while in Hawaii, but he tutored at Starbucks. Parents would drop their kids off and he would tutor chemistry and algebra and such. And so he had a following, but he was homeless. He was unhomed. And he died of scleroderma. He had been found on the side of the road and rather crippled and taken to an emergency room. And someone in the hospital overheard his name, and it was because they worked at Starbucks. And they recognized his name. And they called a social worker on the island, and they got him into the most amazing hospice. It was a beautiful home, like 6 bedrooms, overlooked the ocean, volcano was behind. Every day he could have any food he wanted. What do you want today? So my other brother, my mother, and I went to see him. I had not seen him in 25 years. My brother and my mother had not seen him in 13 years. I walked into the room, and there was something magically ethereal about that. He reminded me of when I saw him when he was 16 years old. He had a kind of youthfulness, even though he was necrotic. His hands were black, his feet were black, but he had a twinkle in his eyes. We had various conversations. He didn't have a lot of stamina, so they'd be brief. One day he was talking about, and when I get out of here, I've got to rent that shed, and then I've got to do this, and then I've got 3 things being reviewed by lawyers for patents, and and it was all of this stuff. And my brother, my mother, and I walked out, and we were with the social worker, and I looked at her and I said, "Does he know he's dying?" And she goes, "Well, here, you're alive until you're not." And that's the story I want to tell you, because that has stayed with me since 2015. And that you're alive until you're not. And that gave him dignity to think and dream and be anything he wanted. It put us in check and able to value those moments with him.
How long did you live after?
3 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyways, I wanted to share that for anyone who's going to be in hospice or something, at the hospice. You're alive until you're not.
We have a message in chat.
Yes,
Do you have your?
a message in chat.
Yes,
Well, can you read it?
I can. So this is from Wit, who says, "I'm working in death because my husband died at 33 in an ICU. I've been a nurse for 14 years and now I'm the manager of the only free social model hospice house in New Mexico. I have so many stories. One that comes to mind is Marty. She came in from out of state to do MAID. medical aid and dying. She left on her own terms on our beautiful porch with a glass of wine and her favorite playlist. Beautiful.
Oh, nice. Yes.
So coincidentally, so I know we work together at Scott's house.
Everybody here.
Like I should say, hi Whit. So I work at Scott's house too with Whit, and Marty was my client. She's the one who flew in from Iowa. The one thing that Whit didn't say was the other thing Marty had with her was her favorite joint. Which they can get.
It's legal in New
That's
Mexico.
what.
Yes, come on up.
Hi, my name is Gloria, and I'd like to share a story of my sister. She died in 2019. She had stomach cancer. She lived in Northern Virginia, and I flew out there several times to be with her. She had multiple surgeries, part of her stomach removed. Ended up having multiple drains and bags. It eventually became almost impossible for her to eat. But she, savored every minute of her life and had incredible friends out in Virginia. I'm from a large family, born and raised here in Albuquerque. And my mom was still alive at that time. So she was 91 years old. And my sister was 68 when she died. And I was with my sister in the hospital. I, am very much a proponent of engaging in hospice as early as possible. And she was hesitant. She said, well, then that means I'm giving up. And I, gave her my spiel that no, you are being supported. You're being supported. You're being cared for. And hospice is also a great support for the family members as well. My sister a lot of her friends, she was a nurse, and a lot of her friends were nurses. And it was very expensive for all the dressings and ostomy bags she was using and all the supplies. What finally convinced my sister to enroll in hospice was, her name was Mary. Her name is Mary. I said, hospice will pay for all of those. That's a covered benefit. And she's like, oh, well then for sure. So that was her key in. And they do indeed. So that's another thing too, if family members are hesitant with hospice, that it's a covered benefit, that all of the medical supplies, all the medical equipment, everything is covered. And I should paraphrase that because that may be with Medicare. So I'm not, that one you need to check on. But anyway, towards the end of her life, she said, I really want to see mom. I really want to see mom. So my sister is now like 85 pounds. It was a big flight from Virginia. Well, it should have been a lesser flight, but anyway, for her, it was a big flight from Virginia to Albuquerque. And she traveled with her best friend, who's a nurse, and her son. And I remember her telling the story of just how she, really put on her makeup and covered all the bags and whatnot that she had, because she was worried that they would not let her on the plane. So she had to make sure that she looked strong enough, healthy enough to actually get this, stay on the flight. Crazy thing, they had a huge storm that hit. And so this plane was diverted to Little Rock, Arkansas. They ended up spending the night there. She had not carried on any of her equipment or anything that she needed. So, you know, her son and her friend were giving her, you know, popsicles and water. They got out of Little Rock, flew into Houston, and then there was mechanical failure. And they spent another night in Houston, so it literally took them 3 days to get to Albuquerque from Virginia, and she was absolutely exhausted when she got here. But I was there with her when they set up, and she was at my mom's house. And so the beautiful thing about hospice too, she was in hospice in Virginia. They called the hospice in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, coordinated everything like to a T, that when she, you know, so I kept calling them, yeah, you know, she was scheduled for the hospice here in Albuquerque. And you know, they were checking with me, has she arrived yet? No, she hasn't arrived yet. But they were there at my mom's house within an hour after she finally arrived in Albuquerque and was at my mom's house. They got, you know, she needed oxygen. I'm trying to think what other things that she needed, but they set up everything, they did the admission. And we made her comfortable there, at my mom's house. You know, the hospice nurses came in and out, they had, you know, supplies delivered, the medication delivered. I mean, everything was just like so smooth in that transition. And, I have, you know, lots of family here in Albuquerque. And we had the nieces and the nephews, and we literally just hung at the house, at my mom's house, for the entire week that my sister was alive in New Mexico. And we cooked, we baked, we talked, we sang songs. My daughter is a musician, her and her bandmate came and played music. We played games. I mean, it was just a love fest for the entire week that my sister was alive. And my sister had actually had a round trip ticket. She thought she was going back to Virginia. And I remember she died on Tuesday, and on Saturday before she died, she was actually supposed to fly home on Sunday. And she said, well, I should start getting things packed. And I said, Mary, you're not gonna, you don't have the strength to fly home. And she said, well, what about all my stuff in Virginia? And I said, we'll take care of it. It's all gonna be taken care of. But I just want to say that hospice is such a valuable resource. And people tend to engage in hospice, enroll in hospice way too late. And it's so important. And, you know, my mom, you know, the doctors had talked previously about, you know, you can graduate from hospice. So, you know, 2 years later, when my mom did die, you know, she had an infection, she was in the hospital, she was in rehab, she enrolled in hospice. And like they shared, you know, she came home, she was eating and with family, and she graduated from hospice 3 months later. And then 3 months after that, you know, she was back in hospice. So hospice is such a great support for the person themselves who is needing the support, and it's such a great support for the family. And that they, again, I have to double check my resources, but both my mom and my sister were, you know, on with Medicare in hospice, and it paid for all of the equipment, you know, whether it was the bedside commode or the wheelchair or the dressings or the ostomy bags, whatever it was. And that the support was so phenomenal, and the bereavement support for both. After my sister died, we accessed bereavement support from the hospice agency in Albuquerque, and after my mom died. So it's just such a valuable tool, and I just want to reemphasize that hospice is not a place. It can be a place, but hospice itself is not a place. It's a form of care for those final moments.
And I'd like to point out that with Dave's hospitalization, We paid a copay for the surgery, we paid a copay for the urgent care visit. And that was it. Medicare covered everything else, then probably our supplemental insurance, but what a blessing is that, so. That alone is a good reason to get on the hospice if you qualify, so. Good conversation, it's gonna continue after lunch, and the pizza's here, woohoo! So let's take a lunch break and we'll see you back at 1 o'clock.